Let's take this further now. Bring in media ethics specialist Professor George Claassen, who's joining us by phone on The Full View. Good to have you on the program, Professor. So, damning audio as well as video released by Pieter-Louis Myburgh in the Daily Maverick this morning of Malaka and her former spokesperson trying to bribe him. But how new is this sort of thing where the powerful who are found or accused of having erred try to use money to kill stories?
Well, there was an old saying by Ed Bradley, who was the editor of the Washington Post during the Watergate scandal. He said, journalists follow the money or follow the women. And in this case, it's follow the money. And Pieter-Louis Myburgh's exposure is exactly doing that. And it is not strange that they're trying to go for journalists, because journalists have been exposing corruption on a wide front in South Africa. For example, the Taco Kuiper Award has been won by numerous journalists all through the years for exposing corruption.
And given what we've heard in this recording then at this stage, what should be the consequences for the CEO and the spokesperson? Well,
it should be dire consequences, and there should be immediate action against these people. Unfortunately, quite often the media are being blamed for bringing the message across. And we quite often find, where I practice as an ombud, public editor, I deal with this consistently, where people want to criticize we as messengers and not looking at the case against the people who are corrupt. So they blame the messengers, the journalists who are doing their job.
But I wonder, in the case of other journalists who may not be of Pieter-Louis Myburgh's seniority or have his experience, etc., what sort of guidelines the average newsroom in this country has got to rely on, where a journalist who's working on a story is confronted with a reality where the person, the newsmaker who's in trouble, says, I will give you 60,000 Rand and perhaps a sweetener of 100,000 Rand here and there frequently if you do not go to print. Do we have clear enough guidelines in all our newsrooms today?
Yes, it is a consistent problem. SANEF, the South African National Editors Forum, we try through training programs and through making journalists aware of the South African Press Code and the Broadcasting Complaints Commission's Code of Ethics. And nobody is beyond bribing. People are human, you know, but the fact is that if you want to be a journalist with integrity, you have to be trained properly to sustain and to uphold the values in journalism, that is to report news accurately, truthfully and fairly, as the press code clearly states. But training is very important.
One of the conclusions, Professor Claassen, drawn by people in reaction to the story today is that these two people, Tebogo Malaka and the spokesperson Phasha Makgolane, would not even have tried, to bribe Pieter-Louis Myburgh if, as they're suggesting, bribery of media people, journalists in particular, wasn't something that's known to happen. And am I right in saying that at this point, neither you and I are in a position to say that it doesn't happen because it relies on a veil of secrecy ultimately?
No, I think there is no evidence that the South African journalist has been bribed to get money, a lot of money to squash a story, to suppress a story. Journalists make mistakes. For example, the Sunday Times apology after the SARS rogue unit exposed so-called evidence of a rogue unit inside SARS, and that was total nonsense. And the Sunday Times had to get back their awards because journalists made mistakes because their egos became in the place of their doing their duty. So journalists should never be in the pockets of politicians. We should be absolutely independent, as the Press Code and the South African Broadcasting Complaints Commission's Code clearly state. So that independence and protect that independence is absolutely vital.
And you mentioned earlier, for example, that SANEF, the South African National Editors Forum, goes into newsrooms to work on training, etc. There was the ethics inquiry. I think the report came out around 2021, if memory serves. I wonder how well we've done as the media fraternity in the implementation of some of what was found there, especially in trying to create a more ethical space and ensure that people aren't, shall we say, manipulated or drawn into a web such as what these two people from the IDT were trying to do in Stellenbosch.
Remember, journalists are under the cosh worldwide. If you look at what's happening in the United States, where there's serious worries about the independence of journalists with President Trump doing all sorts of deals with CBS and other news channels. The fact is that report by the South African National Editors Forum strongly emphasized that media ethics should be very high on the list of journalists being trained, and it is happening. I can state clearly and with a clear conscience that South African journalists are mostly doing very well. We make mistakes, but we are accountable through South African Press Code and the Broadcasting Complaints Commission's code, where people can complain about journalists, but the evidence must be there, and people can't just throw around accusations without any evidence. And unfortunately, politicians are doing that all the time. They blame the courts and they blame the media if they are being exposed.
And we haven't had at this stage any outright sort of attempt to contradict or dispute what we hear and what we saw in the recordings released by Daily Maverick this morning. Do you see or foresee a scenario where there might be any credible evidence to the contrary, or is what we've seen there enough to conclude that there is no other reality except that this was a clear-cut attempt to bribe a journalist?
Yes, absolutely. That video is damning, and it is Pieter-Louis Myburgh has a very high credibility level, if you can call it like that. He won the Taco Kuiper Award for his exposure of the high train engines that was imported from Spain. So credible journalists are hardworking people, and their reputations are on the line. And I think in South Africa we have been doing very well since 1994, where journalists have been fighting against corruption, and they did that also during the apartheid years, where there were very good journalists who were exposing apartheid atrocities.
Good to have your time, Professor Claassen. Thank you so much for your time. That was Professor George Claassen, Media Ombuds Specialist.